Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Thank you very much, Professor Zachary Wright, for inviting me to be on this panel. I'm really excited to be part of this conversation on this lecture series on Islam and transatlantic Black liberation. So I'm grateful for the African Studies program at Northwestern University for taking these initiatives. First of all, I would like to say a little bit about my current research project, my book manuscript, and that I'm working on, and how it ties to the theme of the lecture series on Islam and transatlantic Black liberation. My research concerns the Muslim initiatives of the Harāṭīn communities. Harāṭīn communities often defined as formerly enslaved persons and enslaved persons' descendants in the conventional historic literature, but I analyze them as a complex social category of actors, including freeborn individuals who asserted their Muslim right, especially what I'm looking at in the colonial context in colonial Mauritania. So individuals who asserted their right as full Muslim citizens in colonial Mauritania. So I try to reconstruct the biographies of Harāṭīn men and women who went from being oppressed by the local Muslim elite to playing an important role in the making of French colony in Mauritania. These individuals that I look at, including men and women, they became Muslim authorities, and they were requesting or demanding social and religious equalities with the Byzantines or the Moors, the Byzantine communities, who are the Moors, who are defined as a mix of a group Arab and Berber communities in Mauritania. So I argue that during this period, Harāṭīn colonial employees utilized the opportunities created by the colonial states to accumulate wealth, claim land, but also build political power. And they emerged as icon of Muslim dignity and asserted their rights as Muslims. So this is where Islam becomes important. Harāṭīns are Muslims, and Islam was and still central for Harāṭīn's struggle for social justice and equality even in today's Mauritania, in the colonial period, but also beyond the colonial period, in the post-colonial period. So before I elaborate more on the Harāṭīn communities and how they have employed Islam as a means to assert their right, I would like to reflect a little bit on the concept of race, because I think this is tied to the question, to the series, is Islam and race. So race in these contexts often described, for a long time, when people talk about race in Mauritania, but also beyond Mauritania, in Africa, in the entire continent, it was race seen as a colonial imposition, and really has nothing to do with the local reality. But for the last decade or so, scholars, Africanist scholars and historians have challenged this kind of thinking and looking at the ideas of race that were imposed and created, that how African actually created their own ideas of race and have their own ideas of race that sometimes not really connected to the Europeans' conceptions of race. So I focus, as I said, on the Harāṭīn community and the Bilan. And the Bilan, one of the definition of the Bilan is the Bilan who see people as themselves as white. But the term Bilan applies to all those who speak Hassaniya as their first language, regardless of their skin color or social status. So, for instance, it's common in Mauritania to say someone is, for example, he got black skin, but he's not black. So in fact, the collective, the Bilan are, includes the definition of the Bilan includes the Harāṭīn communities, include light skinned and dark skinned people. So race, I say this because to highlight that race as a Western concept does not help us to understand these societies. So while race is a useful category of a historical analysis, I don't think it's sufficient to understand the complexity of the societies that I'm studying. Other ideologies instead have been mobilized to support, for example, slavery, to create and promote and maintain hierarchical structures. These ideologies were not constricted to race. So, for instance, people have mobilized the idea of the concept of a nasab or genealogical descent as a way to denote social status and privilege. For instance, tracing one's family to the Prophet Muhammad, the family of the Sahaba, the companions of the Prophet, has been central to both historical but also contemporary discourse for constructing distinctions and otherness. So that's one concept. The other concept is the, blood purity, and this is scholars have talked about it and have done a lot of research. Scholars have talked about it, in the context of Northwest Africa, the work of Bruce Hall, the work of Shawki al-Amal, but also in East Africa, you have the work of Jonathan Glassman and others who have really talked about some of these issues. So this is not something that has not been studied. So skin color is very important in this context that I'm looking at, to determine people's social status, but also their birthmark and family lineage. The other thing is Islamic knowledge, and this is really important, how people have employed Islamic knowledge to create and promote and maintain hierarchical structures. It's very important to know that Islam, when you look at the scripture, the Quran and the Hadith, Islam is very clear, is against all form of social and racial discriminations. This is when you read it, you have passages in the Quran, you have Hadith, and you have the Sunnah of the Prophet, where you have really strong stand on this issue of social discrimination. But a lot of Muslims, still use Islamic knowledge to, create differences and to feel they are superior than others. And this in the Mauritanian context, this is very common and very prevalent. People, because they have a better Islamic knowledge, they believe that they have a better DNA, or they come from a certain family of scholars, or family of Sufi scholars, or Sufi shuyukh, and then they believe that they are, superior than the others. So that's very important. Now, how does this tie to the theme of this series? So, I said Islam is very important for the individuals that I'm looking at. So, focusing on the biographies of these Harāṭīn men and women, and how how Islamic piety, these are people who've invested so much in Islam and Islamic education. They supported Islamic schools, they supported masajid because they became wealthy in the colonial context. They also people who wanted to assert themselves as religious authority in this hierarchical context that subjugated some of them and relegated them to inferior position. And this is very important because here is, I'm reflecting on this idea of agency, and here especially the work that I use here, the framework as a framework is the work of Saba Mahmoud, and in her book Islamic Piety, in her book Piety is Politics of Piety, which she argues that she analyzes this women's piety movement in Egypt, and she eliminates how Muslim women is looks at how Muslim women's ability to exert agency within Egyptian Muslim society, not by resisting hierarchical structure oppression in mosque spaces, but by what she calls inhabiting these male-dominated religious circles. So the individuals that I look at is this very interesting way of looking at agency. It's very important as it reveals the varied and complex way in which marginalized groups or people can assert their initiatives and agency, not by subverting norms to make progressive change, but by choosing to purposefully inhabit those norms. So for me, Harāṭīn individuals that I look at in my research is I look at Harāṭīn's effort, and Harāṭīn individuals who exemplify this kind of agency that Saba Mahmoud talks about in her book, as they did not seek to resist slavery, for instance, or challenge, slavery from Islamic perspective, but they strove to excel in piety and assert themselves as part of society. So they invested in Islamic institution, as I said. They built Islamic school. They supported Islamic educationists. So Islam was important to Harāṭīn colonial employees that I'm looking at, even though, and this is very important, even though they had limited Islamic education, but they understood the importance of using religion, using Islam as means to mark piety and strengthen their community sense of Islamic identity. So that's it from me. Thank you so much. Yeah.